What's the purpose of today's discussion? Well, in the news a few weeks back, maybe a bit more than a month now, there was quite a lot of excitement about some letters written to our Prime Minister and many of the members of the cabinet about reprocessing and the potential that Canada could be leading the world in increasing the risk of proliferation, mainly with the idea that Moltex and what was being called in the letters reprocessing could give rise to that route to proliferation. I have written quite extensively on the subject, and it's just been circulated in the newsletter, responding to some of the sillier suggestions that came out in the conspiracy theories. But it is a serious subject. And so, as well as dealing at some point with some of those more conspiratorial type suggestions that have been existed, we do want to hear from Moltex to learn the details of the project, and I want to investigate with Olivier what the real risks of proliferation might be. And so that's the purpose of today's discussion. And with that, I'd like to hand it straight over to Olivier to introduce himself and then talk to us about what Moltex are actually proposing so that we're set up for those questions about proliferation. Over to you, Olivier.
Thank you, Neil, for this presentation. So first of all, for my personal, very short presentation, personal presentation. So I've joined Moltex Energy about 2 years ago now as a nuclear security and safeguards officer, essentially in charge of security by design and safeguards by design in the design of the facilities. And before that, actually, I spent most of my career in a totally different environment, essentially in the military, and most of this in the military intelligence, with a specific focus on non-proliferation, counter-proliferation activities. So I looked at nuclear proliferation issues from the other side of the mirror. So before I begin the actual presentation, I would like to say that I'm speaking today from the city of St. John, New Brunswick, which is a traditional and unceded territory of the Wolastoqey, Mi'kmaq, and Passamaquoddy people. I'm really sorry for my really bad pronunciation. I also would like to ask for some kind of indulgence, because actually English is not my mother tongue. So I will do my best, but at some point it may not be suitable and it may not be enough. Et troisièmement, je voudrais dire que si vous avez des questions en français, si vous voulez les poser en français, n'hésitez pas, je répondrai dans la langue de votre choix. So I'll share a slideshow. I don't know if it's suitable. So this is what brings us together today, is having a look at the concept of recycling and reprocessing and what kind of proliferation concern it may bring. So as Neil mentioned, the topic of the invite was related to some recent media coverage that suggests that any reprocessing of used nuclear fuel is a gateway to weapons production, and that by even considering the so-called Moltex project, Canada may increase the risk of proliferation, but will it? And is what Moltex planning reprocessing anyway? So there are two considerations to look in this global topic. The first one is that more and more it is recognized that closing the fuel cycle may be an important aspect in a quest to a really sustainable energy production. But the second aspect is that recycling and reprocessing are seen as sensitive activities due to some proliferation concern. So how do we reconcile these considerations? This is what we will try to find out today. So first of all, I will have a small presentation on what we mean with the Moltex project, a small outline of this this topic, because not everybody may be familiar with what we plan to do. The second is look at some general considerations on the perception of proliferation potential, and then maybe go back to basics on explaining what we hear by non-proliferation, what we hear with the concept of safeguards, reprocessing, recycling, what are the definitions of these kind of concepts and so on. And then look at the different proliferation metrics that we can find to objectively assess proliferation potential in different fuel cycle options, whether we use reprocessing or not. And then we see what kind of conclusions we can bring from there on. And then some good discussions, obviously. So first of all, what we call what the Moltex project is, there are actually two significant, there are two key elements. The first one is the reactor, the so-called stable salt reactor waste burner. And actually, everything is in the name. So it's a fast neutron molten salt reactor that uses recycled nuclear waste as fuel. So in this first of a kind project, it would be spent CANDU fuel that is on the Point-le-Bro site, either already present on site or that will be generated until the end of life of the currently existing CANDU reactor. And then the second element, obviously, is a facility that turns this nuclear waste into fresh fuel for the reactor. And this is the so-called waste to stable salt, the WATS facility, which is a high temperature molten salt based conversion process. So it is significantly different than the liquid extraction technique that is typically used in the Purex process that has been used in some countries until now. So today, in order to make a suitable assessment on the proliferation potential, first of all, I would like to draw attention on the fact that there's no black or white categories. There's no one solution that is perfectly that is perfect, let's say, that is completely white option and that is no drawbacks. Another one that is really a black one and that is absolutely unaffordable to use. It's something in between. All options have advantages and drawbacks, and it's all of them have some aspects that need to be taken into account and compensated. So the second consideration that I need to highlight is that we have to acknowledge that there's a specific ideological opposition to reprocessing, specifically to reprocessing. So obviously reprocessing had been one component of nuclear weapons development, as well as reactors have been, as well as uranium enrichment has been, but specifically reprocessing is has ideological opposition because essentially for anti-nuclear activists, the mere possibility that spent fuel can be recycled can lead to the possibility for nuclear to become truly sustainable option. And this is not acceptable to them. This would mean that they were wrong. How could they accept? So reprocessing in general has been the specific target of an ideological opposition for this reason. And I think it's important to keep this in mind if we really want to objectively assess the potential risk versus other technologies, or even versus not using it. Then if we look at an objective assessment, this actually could be surprising or counterintuitive for some of them. And this would be a gateway to really break the deep-rooted prejudice against this kind of technology. So if we go back to basics and look at some key concepts, first of all, I'd like to look at the concepts of non-proliferation, proliferation resistance, safeguards. Maybe it's sometimes it's used interchangeably, and some people may not really see the difference between these concepts, which are very different. I would like to spend a little bit of time on these words. First of all, non-proliferation is the goal, is the overarching goal and actually the goal is to avoid and to prevent that the development of nuclear weapons goes beyond those that currently are allowed to do it. This is, in a few words, what non-proliferation means. And this can be done by several different approaches. Actually, these different approaches can be seen as some kind of a defense in depth against proliferation, some kind of defense in depth provide assurance that proliferation is limited. One layer in this defense in depth can be represented by intrinsic characteristics of a technology or material. And this is what we typically mean with proliferation resistance. This is the intrinsic characteristics of a material or a technology. And a totally different approach is to look at safeguard measures and looking at and verification. Actually, it's some kind of verification by the IAEA that some diversion could not take place or did not take place. So those two aspects of intrinsic characteristics in one way and the reduction of the attractiveness in terms of proliferation, and on the other hand, verification by a third party that no diversion actually occurs, are two different things that sometimes that actually go in the same direction, that reinforce each other, but that do not always go in the same are not always aligned. Let's say. For example, I take an example. It's for plutonium, for example. Whatever the isotopic composition of plutonium, it is always regarded in the same category in terms of safeguards. So its quantity is done the same way in terms of safeguards, whatever the amount of plutonium-240 that we can have in the mix. However, in terms of proliferation resistance, in terms of attractiveness of the material, there are different categories. Plutonium can be considered as weapons-grade plutonium, fuel-grade plutonium, reactor-grade plutonium. There are different categories that clearly represent that not all of them have the same attractiveness in terms of proliferation. Not all of them has the same proliferation resistance. So in terms of safeguards, all of them are considered the same, but in terms of intrinsic resistance, it is different. And so we should not always consider safeguards categories to assess proliferation resistance. Now, if we look at the different concepts of reprocessing versus recycling, it's also important to understand what we mean with these words. So there are two ways to look at these concepts. The first is to see what is the practical meaning, how they are used in general, or to see at official definitions. So in their practical meaning, most of the people in the field consider that reprocessing is the chemical separation of the constituents of spent fuel. So separation of chemical elements of spent fuel, and then reuse of these elements in order to create new fresh fuel. This is recycling. This is how it is generally understood, generally considered. The problem is with these definitions is that the extraction of radioisotopes from irradiated fuel for medical purposes should also be considered as reprocessing in this case. And the production of cobalt-60 for industrial irradiation is also reprocessing. And this is the kind of thing that is done every day in Canada. Is it actual reprocessing? Not really. So we see that there's already a limit to this kind of practical meaning. So the best is to look at official definitions. What is actually reprocessing? I have to admit that I have not found any official definition of reprocessing in the CNST reg docs. However, I could find one in the protocol additional to the comprehensive safeguard agreement signed between Canada and the IAEA. And this definition is the following one. So it's separation of plutonium and uranium from intensely radioactive fission products, okay, and other transuranic elements. And this is in the definition. This is separation from fission products and other transuranic elements, which means other than plutonium and uranium, these are the minor actinides. This is in the protocol additional to the CSA. It's exactly the same wording that we can find in the trigger list of the Zanger Committee. It's exactly the same wording that we can find in the US Code of Federal Regulation. This is the only official definition that I could find. Now, in terms of recycling, then I have to admit that I have found absolutely no official definition, nowhere. The only place where I could find something that resembles a little bit of a definition is literally in a footnote of a white paper of a US NRC document specifically related to a gap analysis related to the lack of definition. And the wording here is this one. It's a separation of constituents of spent nuclear fuel and refabrication of fresh fuel containing plutonium, minor actinides, and possibly some fission products. So it means that actually it includes a step of separation as well as a step of fabrication. So it's wider in scope than just the reprocessing. But on the other hand, the separation does not necessarily lead to separated plutonium from fission products and minor actinides. And this is a fundamental difference. It's the level of separation of plutonium from other species. So in this case, we see that we could consider that there could be recycling that does not involve reprocessing. We can have recycling that involves reprocessing, but we can have recycling that does not. And so this leads us to the concept of separated plutonium and how this impacts on proliferation. So the relevance of this concept of separated or non-separated plutonium, actually the relevance of still keeping minor actinides, lanthanides, and other fission products in the mix actually, can be related to specific technical barriers to the proliferation when we still have such components. One of these technical barriers, which is widely accepted, is the radioactivity, the level of radioactivity that is represented typically by the remaining fission products. But there's another one. There are actually three other ones, but there's another one that is very, very important as well. It's a spontaneous neutron emission. And this neutron emission is actually the basis for the different proliferation resistance categories of plutonium that I mentioned previously. The weapons grade, fuel grade, reactor grade. This is typically related to the spontaneous emission of neutrons by plutonium-240. And actually, if we still have minor actinides in the mix, It is extremely important because the level of neutron emission from these minor actinides is 2 orders of magnitude higher than what plutonium-40 can bring. So I repeat, it's not 2 times more, it's 2 orders of magnitude more than plutonium-40. So it completely dwarfs the consideration of weapons-grade plutonium or reactor-grade plutonium. It has no value anymore, because what minor actinides bring is so much more important than what plutonium-240 may bring in the mix, that it's absolutely not possible to imagine building a bomb with if minor actinides are not separated. So if we want to produce weapons-grade material from there on, we need to do another separation in another facility with another technology. And finally, if we have to consider all of this, this means that we are not any closer to building a bomb than not separating it in the first place. So if we look at these different technical barriers that are mentioned according to the kind of elements that can remain in the mix, some of them are very specific to what minor actinides may bring. Some of them are more specific to fission products, but all of them finally can bring such barriers. And this provides some framework for the application of an actual graded approach specific to the different separation technologies that may be considered. So now, in terms of the comparison of the different open fuel cycles that we may have, and to have some objective comparison between these fuel cycles, methodology here would be to consider widely recognized metrics, widely accepted metrics to compare these merits in terms of proliferation. And this is provided by the IAEA estimated conversion times. And then looking at the evolution of these metrics at the different stages of the backhand of different fuel cycles. So these conversion times are determined by the IAEA, and if we translate what this means in terms of the material that we can have at the backhand of the fuel cycles, we can determine estimated conversion times for different kinds of material, ranging from chemical compounds that contains purified plutonium right after a Purex treatment, for example, which is a 1-week conversion time. This is the lowest proliferation resistance category, let's say, to conditioned irradiated fuel with a 3-month estimated conversion time. And even if we completely remove plutonium, or at least to the level where uranium becomes the most preferred proliferation route, then the estimated conversion time goes up to 12 months if we really transmute the actinides present in the mix. Now, if we take these metrics and we plot them according to the different stages of the back end of the fuel cycle, this is what we can have for the open cycle. So right after irradiation, we are at a 1-month conversion time. And then after waste conditioning, we go down to 3 months, which is a decrease in the proliferation potential, an increase in the proliferation resistance. And we remain at this level of 3 months up to a very long time. And at the right hand of the graph, we can see that it increases. It's actually related to the fact that the self-protecting nature of this material ultimately degrades and disappears. So this is on a very long-term period. So although it is acknowledged that at this time the material is deemed irrecoverable, and the safeguards can be discontinued for practical reasons. As I said previously, sometimes what we consider for safeguards does not exactly match with what we consider as a metrics for non-proliferation. Besides, these values of conversion time do not include the time it would take to recover the canisters from a deep geological repository, which is also a big impact and a big barrier to proliferation to consider. But at least this provides a basis for comparison and basis for discussion. So if now we compare this to a conventional reprocessing with a Purex kind of reprocessing and then refabrication of fresh fuel for example in a MOX for a fleet of light water reactors, actually we have an increase of the proliferation potential at some point because of the separation and the creation of separated plutonium in this case, in which the conversion time is decreased to 1 week, so it's an increase of the proliferation potential, which is decreased later when the fuel is actually re-irradiated and reused. So this is one aspect. Obviously, in this case, we also have the isotopic composition of plutonium that we don't consider here, which should also be taken into account. But this is the metric that is used, and we see that here we have a difference. On the other hand, if we consider recycling in which we do not produce separated plutonium, this is what we have. This is how it compares to the other fuel cycle options. So yes, at some point we have some level of separation, but we still keep minor actinides in the mix, lanthanides in the mix. So we don't go up to a 1 week conversion time. Difference is from 1 month to 3 weeks. So how does it? Is it actually relevant in this case? But especially after irradiation and transmutation of the actinides in the reactor, we completely consume the actinides, and then we have a real drop in proliferation potential from 3 months to 12 months, because here at this point it's uranium that becomes the most suitable and the preferred proliferation route, and it remains at this level indefinitely, because actually plutonium has been removed, simply said. We can even go deeper in this analysis and see that if the facility is a combined recycling and transmutation facility co-located with the storage of the spent fuel, there's no transportation, there's no transport of spent fuel that has to be considered. And so we have this trade-off in a slight increase of proliferation potential at a limited time, moment in space and in time. And then we have this drop in proliferation potential. It is actually relevant to realize that this trade-off takes place actually where further safeguard measures are the most easily implemented, because we are in the same facility where we do not go out of sight. It's within a facility that is already covered by safeguards, whereas the typical security and safeguard choke points represented by transport, in this case, what we see even with the open cycle is higher than the material that has been transmuted. So fundamentally here, even with the traditional reprocessing activities, the fact that that further safeguards can be applied in order to manage this aspect has been recognized as through the COG initiative and the identified high-level guiding principles. So here, even for reprocessing, and these 6 high-level guiding principles, that is, should be done for peaceful uses only, in respect of Canada's international obligations, limit the risks to health and safety, and so on. All of these considerations will actually be addressed simply by adhering to current regulations. So we don't even need a new regulatory framework. Everything is already in place in Canada to apply these further considerations and make sure that the trade-off that we can have at some point in the fuel cycle are actually managed and are actually addressed. So fundamentally, what I would like to highlight is that, first of all, recycling of spent nuclear fuel does not necessarily involve separation of plutonium from other actinides, and so it does not necessarily involve reprocessing. The second thing that is important to keep in mind is that there is no perfect option. And although the once-through open fuel cycle is seen as a baseline, it is not a perfect option in terms of proliferation either. So the point is that claiming that we should avoid reprocessing because it has some proliferation potential, it is wrong, because the fact that because not using it also could represent some proliferation concerns that are actually managed and mitigated by current measures. So taken more broadly, spent fuel recycling really offers the potential to actually decrease the proliferation risk, especially on the long term. And the localized, whether in space and in time, increase of the proliferation potential is actually a trade-off that can be mitigated by appropriate safeguards measures, and especially when the recycling does not involve reprocessing. So finally, it is important to acknowledge that different technologies, different recycling technologies, represent different degrees of proliferation resistance. And this is the only leverage that we can have in order to promote the most proliferation resistant ones. So globally, what I like to point out is that claiming that reprocessing is bad and then therefore it should be avoided is exactly the same thing as claiming that nuclear in general is bad and should be avoided. This is the kind of argumentation that we are all familiar with in the nuclear industry. We know that this argumentation is wrong and is ideologically driven, because the point is, first, that okay, the technology is associated with an identified and acknowledged risk. This is something that we do not want to hide. Obviously, we know, and this is the only way that we can actually address it. Second, this risk can be limited in scope and actually suitably mitigated, and especially with some technical options. Besides, any alternative to this technology also carries drawbacks. So there are some trade-offs in all kinds of options, and considered broadly, the suitable application of this technology actually represents the best compromise, as with nuclear energy at large, and as with the discussion on all energy options in general. So I thank you for your attention, and I would be happy to bring this discussion further with your comments, your questions.
Great, and we have questions coming in, and Olivier, thank you so much for that. I think if anything else, it highlights how complex some of the issues are, and perhaps how easy it is for people to become confused about them. So I'm going to try and tackle this from the other point of view. You were talking there about the way that proliferation resistance changes. I'm going to try and do it from a more simple point of view and look at what it is that could give rise to proliferation from what you're doing and investigate some of those. So the first is I'd like to cover off possibly, I think, the simplest of the conspiracy theories. So very early on, when this was happening, we saw a letter in the Hill Times from Professor Romana and Susan O'Donnell, who were trying to suggest that you are the front end of a Canadian program to build weapons. Could you expand a little bit on the possibility of that being the case?
So, as I mentioned previously, in terms of the assurance of non-proliferation, it is not one aspect that is to be taken into account. There are many layers to give this assurance of non-proliferation. So,
so actually, what they were proposing is that basically Canada has torn up the non-proliferation agreement and has decided to set out on a weapons program. Does that sound realistic to you?
Actually, I don't even know where to begin with, because this is so irrelevant, actually.
Yes.
Because fundamentally, the application of recycling, and even the application of pure X reprocessing that could provide separated plutonium, is not against against what Canada has agreed to. It is not against is I don't find the suitable word, but it is possible for Canada to use full-scale reprocessing. This is not prohibited. Let's say this is possible under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. There's no limitation in this case. What is prohibited under the Non-Proliferation Treaty is actually to build a weapons program and so on. But the use of technologies such as reprocessing or even uranium enrichment and this kind of thing is absolutely not in contravention to the international obligations of Canada. This is the first point. The second one is that whatever the technologies that are used in the country, we're still there are still some assurances that there's no diversion given by the IAEA, either on the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement, which highlights that officially recognized facilities are under safeguards and there are verification that there's no diversion and so on, as well as the additional protocol that is in force in Canada, which gives the IAEA the right to verify that there's no undisclosed facilities on the territory. So whether or not the one type of technology is used, there are still this layer of assurance, of non-proliferation assurance that remains. So and on top of that, if in addition to this, we use a technology that does not even produce separated plutonium, then it's even impossible to practically get to this point. Whether or not it is verified or not, it's still impractical. And if we want to get to this point, what we would need in excess to a separation process that would not lead to separated plutonium would be another facility, another Purex facility. We would need a full-scale Purex facility on top of that. So it's exactly the same as not having the recycling facility in the first place. It would be exactly the same.
No, so basically there are no signs that Canada is setting out on a weapons program and using you as a quiet front end, because we're not doing any of the other things that would need to be done. And therefore it's a complete irrelevance, I was trying to kick the can on that one quite quickly. But in your answer, you have kind of touched on a question that's just come up, and it's about comparing the what we called reprocessing in the plant in the past. And I really appreciated your discussion there on the difference between reprocessing and recycling, because whenever you say reprocessing, to me, I think of separating out plutonium using an aqueous process, big plant, lots of contamination all over the place, big problems.
That's it.
Right? And so as soon as you say that, that's in my mind. Now, a lot of people haven't appreciated that what you're proposing is very different. So can you talk a little bit about actually the size of your process and what it involves, so that we can differentiate that from the environmental mess that aqueous reprocessing can sometimes cause?
Yeah, so here the process is exclusively in molten salt, molten metal process at very high temperature, but there's no aqueous or organic solvent extraction that is at stake. And so this enables to separate most of the fission product, but the minor actinides remain in the mix. And this is something that is possible with the SSRW reactor, because since it's a fast neutron reactor, we can afford to have minor actinides. And this is actually a good point, because this does not affect the neutronics performance of the reactor, but on the same time, we're able to transmute these elements in the reactor. So we do not separate them, and we transmute them. So in the end, they are burned, and they disappear from the waste stream that we have to manage in the end.
Right. But I don't think we got to the core of that, the question there, which is your process is thermoelectric refining. So the volume is never any bigger than the volume of the fuel, whereas when we are doing an aqueous refining, we have to dissolve it, so we have vast quantities of material. Is that not the core to the environmental difference between the two?
Yeah.
And you can't
actually,
really
the point is that it's not really actual refining. It's based on the redox potentials of different species, but fundamentally, this is the point, that the volumes are totally different from what we could expect from large facilities typically associated with Purex, which are really huge plants. Here it's the kind of thing that is done in a hot cell in a small building on the sidelines of the reactor. It is absolutely not comparable to a huge industrial facility that we can think about.
Great. So I think, and the key thing there is to separate these two things: reprocessing of the past, which was large, complex, very difficult, and what you're proposing, which doesn't have to do the same level of refinement, is much smaller and much more controllable as a process. I want to investigate the next stage of the potential for proliferation. And we have a lot of very interesting questions coming in. We might have to have a separate session with Moltex about what your project is, but I want to try and stay focused on the main topic here, which is the potential for proliferation. So the next thing that people were suggesting is that because you're going through one stage of the process, people could come in, steal some of your material, and then go away, and you've done most of the job for them. They can then run a Purex plant, but you've gone through most of the challenging recycling and given them a better product if they come and steal it. What protections have you got against people coming and stealing some of the stuff from you as you operate the process?
Yeah, actually here the co-location of the facilities is already a physical protection means that is very important, because we remain within the site, and we can recycle the material and then transmute it and re-irradiate it in a closed set of environment. So we have very compelling physical barriers that can be broke significantly more than if we were to produce a material and then ship it to another facility, to a fleet of reactors. So this aspect is very important. Now, the second thing is to consider that if we consider that most of the job is already done, it is misleading, because actually we would still need the same kind of technology, whether we start from spent fuel or we start from this recycled fuel. We still require the same kind of facility. And actually, there's one amusing thing, let's say, that could be highlighted, is that there's a study released in 2009 that is actually critical to reprocessing in general and recycling at large, because it brought the conclusion that even alternative technologies to Purex do not really bring, so this is what they claim, do not really bring real advantages over in terms of proliferation. But what is important to mention in this study is that actually the assumptions that they took are actually more relevant than the conclusions that they drew, because what they try to look at is the proliferation concerns from a transfer of technology to a fictional country, which would already have Purex capabilities, which would already have the technology to master Purex, and which would already have the resources in material and finance and logistics to build covered facilities. So actually, they are looking at the level of proliferation risk in a situation where the proliferation risk is already elevated before any technology transfer. So obviously, their conclusion is that there's not really a big difference between the different end states, because finally the end state would be exactly the same if there were no technology transfer at all. The country already have spent fuel, the country already has spent fuel, the country already has the technology to use a Purex facility, and already the resources to build covered facilities. So obviously all the end states are the same. But what is interesting in this study is that they acknowledge that if we do not produce separated plutonium in a separation facility, anyway, we need to go through a Purex-like process in a covered facility to get to the last stage of the proliferation chain. So they acknowledge that this is definitely necessary anyway to process this in this kind of facility, whether we start from the spent fuel or we start from the recycled fuel. The next steps are the same. So we're not any closer, actually.
Right. That's good. So, you know, because one of the things I talk about when, because I have to bring things down to a very simple level that I can understand. And in terms of proliferation resistance, I use the analogy of running away from a bear. You don't have to be the fastest, you just have to not be the slowest. And if there's an easier way for people to do it, then they're going to go for the easier way. So I think, you know, a lot of the theme of what you've been saying to us today is, yeah, you know what, you can't guarantee anything against being completely proliferation resistant, but why do it the hard way when there are easier ways to do it? And again, dragging it down to my simple level, you know, one of the things I look at is, well, the first thing is you wouldn't start with used fuel from a civil nuclear reactor because it hasn't got the right makeup of plutonium in it. But you're reprocessing and then putting through the fast reactor. What I'm not clear about is, in that process, do you change the makeup of the plutonium to make it a more of a proliferation risk? Or is it still that you wouldn't start there, you'd start with a research reactor and run it in such a way to create the plutonium that you wanted?
And actually, the more we recycle the material and the burnup, the level of burnup of the plutonium increases, and at this point, the isotopic composition of plutonium is degraded in terms of its proliferation, its attractiveness in terms of proliferation. The more we recycle it, the more the more plutonium-240 we can have in the mix and so on. And so it becomes less and less attractive in terms of proliferation, even only with its isotopic composition. And on top of that, we have all the other elements that spoil the potential to proliferation and that require some further treatment. But in this case, even with further treatment, we're still stuck with the problems of the isotopic composition, which will not be modified by recycling.
Right. Okay, that's good, because that was the one area I was uncertain about. So as you run the process, it actually gets worse. And I think you said something earlier on, which I've taken a while to pick up on, but in your system where you have the reactor and the recycling plant next door to each other, there's never a very big inventory of proliferation material. Is that right? Because you're just recycling the same material, so you never build up a huge quantity at any one time.
Fundamentally, the starting amount of plutonium we will have to deal with on the whole lifetime of the facility is the amount of plutonium that is already present in the spent fuel at the site where the facility will be built. So this is actually the starting point is actually the amount of plutonium that Pointe-le-Pro will have produced over its whole entire lifetime. So the point is that here there's a reduction in the proliferation because plutonium is already there.
Right. Okay.
So it will have been transmuted.
And I apologize for the people that do have very specific questions about your technology, but trying to deal with this safeguard issue that was the safeguards issue and the security issue that was very much in the
and by the way, I would like to emphasize that I'm not able to speak more about the specific of the technology itself. So I think I will go deeper in detail anyway.
I have a hunch, looking at the questions, we need to invite Rory back, and Rory O'Sullivan is the president of Moltex Canada, to come back and answer some of these questions about the project. But very, very quickly, because we don't have much long, we're down to a technology transfer. You're going to design this plant, build it, you could sell it to other countries. Does that mean that we are now giving a previously non-nuclear country the opportunity to get into weapons making? 2
Actually,
minutes.
as I mentioned previously, when I refer to the definition of reprocessing, the fact that we're not separating, that it's not suitable for the separation of minor actinides, makes that this technology is not considered as reprocessing by under the trigger list of the Zanger Committee, which is considered as the reference by all exporting nations in the nuclear suppliers group, including Canada. This means that actually the technology would be considered as containing some elements relevant to reprocessing, but would not be reprocessing as such. And actually, even if it was reprocessing, it would still be possible under the current agreements. And this means that the safeguards that would have been to be considered, and the politics for the export control of Canada, is that these kinds of exports should be very, very carefully related to countries that are under a comprehensive safeguard agreement with the IAEA, as well as a specific bilateral agreement with Canada, supported by an administrative arrangement, and blah, 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 blah. So it is very well carefully considered who we could transfer the technology to. And,
Right.
and this is actually, and the fact that it would specifically be under safeguards in a country in which the IAEA has a safeguards agreement and an additional protocol in place is very important to consider. Obviously, if it's towards one of the nuclear armed nations, such as US, UK, or France, then the situation is totally different, because officially there's nothing that prevents them under the non-proliferation treaty to have these kinds of programs. But anyway, in this case, the Canadian policy in terms of export control is that even for them, it should be only for peaceful purpose, under verification that it would not be transferred from their civilian program to their military program.
Great. Well, Olivier, we have only just started on the questions. I think we're going to come back to Moltex and ask you to come back and talk about your project. But today we've been investigating the proliferation issues. I think we have learned that you are not the front end of a secret government program that nobody, including the government, understands is in existence to create weapons in Canada, because that's stupid. And I don't know where the people that came up with that idea got it from. You are not in the process of producing something that somebody could easily come and steal, because there isn't going to be much of it there, and the process doesn't help them. They might as well go direct and cut you out of the system, so there's no point in that. And from a technology transfer point of view, you're not transferring anything that's going to give anybody an upper hand on creating weapons anyway. So from a proliferation point of view, so far as you're concerned, and so far as anyone can tell looking at what you're doing, there is no increase in risk. We always accept that there is a risk, because you never know what people are going to do, but there is no increase in risk from the activities that Moltex are involved in. Is that a reasonable summary of what you've told us today? That
seemed to be a very good summary. And thank you, Neil, for this opportunity to present this kind of
Great.
message.
Well, we are past time, and we try and keep things on time because people have busy schedules. So thank you everybody for tuning in. I have noticed that there are a lot of questions. We will be printing those questions out and endeavoring to answer them. I have also taken note that people are interested in the project, and we will try on and lay on another intelligence update to cover those questions. And my apologies to the people that I didn't ask their questions for, because I did want to keep this session focused on the proliferation issue. And clearly we needed many more hours in order to do that. But we've tried to do it as neatly and as succinctly as we can. So thank you very much, Olivier. Thank you very much to the audience. I hope you have a great day and a great Christmas season and a Happy New Year. Thank you.
Thank you.